The wind turned wrong in the middle of the provost's speech, and Warden HFY was the only one on the ceremony ground who noticed, because she was the only one watching the animal instead of the podium. The animal's name was Sorrel, though the Office of Wild Integrity refused to print it on any form. On the form she was subject R12, a female sythar of 4 years, shoulder high at the keel, slate and tawny, with the storm gray mane that ran from her skull to the base of her tail lying flat along her spine, way it did when she was thinking. Seja had spent 11 seasons watching sythar think. The mane told you everything if you bothered to learn its grammar. Flat meant patience. Half-raised meant a question. Fully raised meant the wind had brought something worth dying over, and in the last few heartbeats of Provost Casimir Hule's address to the assembled dignitaries of 3 districts, Sorrel's mane went from flat to half to full, and nobody on the platform saw it but the warden standing post at the transfer pen. Seja lifted her hand off the rail and keyed her collar mic. "Gate crew, hold. Warden, the provost is almost at the queue," the gate sergeant answered. He says the words, we pull the pins, the beast walks into the unfenced. Everyone applauds and goes home. "The beast isn't looking at the gate," Seja said. "Hold." Below the platform, on grass mowed white and short for the occasion, 200 guests sat in folding rows with their backs to the open country. That was the first thing Seja had objected to when the Bureau sent the ceremony plan: civilians seated with their backs to the unfenced, on the wrong side of the stone line, because the view photographed better. She had been overruled in writing. The Office of Wild Integrity had organized 11 of these release ceremonies across the colony worlds this year. The plan noted, and not one had produced an incident. Provost Huell had personally appended a line to her objection file. A release is a civic act. The public must witness the severance, or the severance teaches nothing. Severance. The word was carved into the program cards on every guest's seat. The severance standard. Returning the wild to the wild. 30 days of stranger handling. Scent stripping. The silent gate. Every cord between beast and man cut clean before the gate ever opened, so that what walked out was an animal and not somebody's brokenhearted mistake. Huell had written the standard 20 years ago, and the Bureau had administered it like scripture ever since, and Seja had enforced it herself on more releases than she cared to count. And this morning was the first time in her career she had stood close enough to a subject during the reading to watch the doctrine fail in real time. Because Sorrel was not looking at the gate, and she was not looking at the crowd, and she was not looking at the dim figure of the old human male roped off at the far edge of the gallery where the severance choreography had banished him. She was looking at the drainage cut that ran along the east edge of the ceremony ground, where the white grass ended and the real grass began, and her mane was standing like a storm front, and her nostrils were working the wind in slow, deliberate pulls. Seja turned her head and tasted the wind herself. Her people were the Thescan, herd stock from the dust plains of a world that had been all teeth once. Her ancestors had survived 100,000 years of being hunted by learning to read hunters, and the Bureau hired Thescan wardens for exactly that inheritance. Second eyelids slid down against the glare, broad ears unfolded and turned, carrion breath. Faint low to the ground, moving up the cut with the patience of something heavy. "Gate crew," she said quietly. "We have a carg in the east drainage." A pause. "Say again, warden." "The first offering," Seja said. The Bureau had staked a cold brune 100 paces beyond the stone line, dressed and bled at dawn, so that the moment of release would photograph as providence, the wild providing for its returned daughter. 40 kilos of fresh meat upwind of every scavenger on the roan sweep. Your ceremony rang the dinner bell. It's answering. Get the provost off that platform and get those people on their feet, slowly, and start them west. Warden, I can't interrupt thee. The carg came out of the drainage cut the way carg always came, which was all at once. One heartbeat the cut was a green seam in the gold of the steppe. The next, 400 kilos of plate-browed ambusher was up on the flat and moving, low and wide and gray as wet slate, its jaw already swinging open on its sideways hinge. Seja had seen carg take down brune calves and once a mounted survey rider. They were not fast over distance. Over 40 paces they were faster than panic. It did not go for the offering. The offering was past the crowd, and the crowd had begun to move, and carg were drawn to motion the way water is drawn downhill. A district magistrate's aide stood up screaming, and the scream chose the target for it. The folding rows went over in a white clatter. 200 guests who had never in their lives been on the wrong side of a fence discovered all at once what the stone line was for. The gate sergeant was shouting on the open channel. The honor guard, ceremonial carrying ceremonial pikes, did exactly what ceremony had trained them to do, which was nothing. Provost Huell stood at the podium with his mouth still shaped around the unsaid word severance, gripping the lectern, and Seja was running, and she was already doing the arithmetic that wardens do and finding it bad. She was 80 paces out with a stun lance built for animals half that size. The Karg was 40 paces from the front row. And there was nothing on the ceremony ground fast enough to matter. She was wrong. There was one thing. Sorrel went over the transfer pen's forward wall without touching it. The wall stood the height of a tall man. She rose past it like the ground had flexed and thrown her, mane full, body flattening into the long-reaching stride that gave Sythar their plane's name, Windrunner, and Seja would testify later, under oath, before the Bureau and the recorder drones and the gods of her grandmothers, that the animal made no sound at all. No challenge, no cry. Sythar hunt in relays and the relay does not announce itself. Sorrel crossed the ceremony ground in the time it took the Karg to gather itself for. The rush that would have ended a dozen lives, and she hit it shoulder to shoulder at full stretch and then turned it the way a river turns a log. The two animals went down the slope in a tangle that tore the white grass to the roots. The Karg came up first, jaw swung wide, and Sorrel was already inside the swing. What followed took 4 seconds. Seja had it on her body recorder and would watch it many times in the weeks after, frame by frame, and every time she would notice the same thing. There was no fury in it. There was nothing personal in it at all. Sorrel took the Karg's throat the way wardens were taught to take a pin out of a gate with exact economy, and held it down through its last heavy spasms with her eyes already up and moving across the crowd, the platform, the old man at the rope line, counting her people the way a shepherd counts. Then it was over. The Karg lay still. The wind moved the grass. 200 guests of the Office of Wild Integrity stood frozen between their overturned chairs, staring at an apex predator standing over a kill in the middle of their civic ceremony, blood bright on the white grass, and the silence was the deepest Seja had ever heard on the sweep. Sorrel lifted her head and shook her mane flat. She stepped off the carcass. And then, with 200 witnesses and 40 recorder drones watching, the most dangerous animal on the Roan sweep walked quietly across the ruined ceremony ground, past the open gate to the wild that the Bureau had spent 30 days and considerable public money preparing for her, and sat down in front of a roped-off old man in a seed station coat, facing outward toward the grass, between him and everything else in the world. The old man put one weathered hand down on her shoulder, light as a leaf. "Good girl," said Dane Mercer, 63 years old, horticulturist 3rd grade, in the mild voice of a man remarking on the weather. "Easy now, you're done." The mane went down. The amber-green eyes half closed. 400 kilos of dead Karg cooled in the grass 30 paces away, and the beast that had killed it leaned into the old man's hip like a porch dog. And that was the moment, Seja would think later, the exact moment, when the severance standard died. It just took the rest of the season for the Bureau to hold the funeral. Provost Casimir Hule did not see a doctrine die. He saw his ceremony bleeding on the grass. He came down from the platform white to the lips, and he was shouting before his boots hit the ground, and what he was shouting was procedure. Containment team forward, gallery to the vehicles, recorder drones to evidence lock, all feeds, every frame. He was a tall man for his kind, a hollow-boned offeret with the gray crest and blade-thin face of his species, and he had survived 40 years of Bureau politics by being the first voice in every silence, and his voice now cut across the crowd like a lash. "Warden Vale, why is that animal loose?" "That animal," Seja said, "is the only reason your gallery is alive, Provost." "That animal," Huel said, "just killed wildlife at a civic event in front of 3 districts." He stopped 2 paces from her. Up close, she could see his crest trembling. He had been afraid, she realized. He had stood on that platform and been afraid with everyone else. And there are officials who forgive the witnesses to their fear, and there are officials who file charges. It went over a regulation barrier. It made an unsanctioned kill inside the ceremony perimeter. And then, Warden, in front of every recorder on the sweep, it ran straight to the handler whose scent we spent 30 days stripping out of its world. 30 days of severance protocol, and it sat down at his feet like a hearth pet. He turned to take in the crowd, the drones, the magistrates being helped up out of the wreckage of their chairs. And Seja watched him do the thing he was a master of, the thing she could never do, which was to find the version of events that fed him. His crest stilled, his voice dropped into its public register. "You all saw it," he said, carrying now an address. "The Bureau thanks the spirits no one was harmed. And the Bureau grieves because what you witnessed is precisely what the severance standard exists to prevent. That is not a wild animal. That is a weapon with a favorite person. The release has failed. Subject R12 will be remanded to permanent containment at the Kalden Annex. Effective, the gate is open," Seja said. She did not say it loudly. Thescan voices do not carry the way Offeret voices carry. Her people evolved whispering on a plane full of ears. But she said it into the body recorder range of 40 drones. And she said it in the language of the release code, and she saw the gate sergeant's head come up, and she saw Huel stop. "Clarify, Warden." "Release code part 1, Seja said. A release begins when the range gate opens on a live subject and ends when the range warden closes it. Your crew pulled the pins on my order at the start of your speech, Provost. The gate at Threshold Station 6 is open. The subject is uncleared for transfer, and that makes this a live release in progress on my range, under my warrant. You can't remand an animal that the code says is mid-release. There is no such procedure. Then I instruct you to close the gate. No, Seja said. The word went out over the white grass and the blood and the 200 listening guests, and Seja felt it leave her the way you feel a stone leave your hand, with the knowledge that no force in the world will bring it back. Huel's crest rose, slow. Warden Vale, I wrote the standard your warrant enforces. And the standard sits inside the code, not on top of it, Seja said. Part 1, Section 3, the threefold gate. Every approved release subject is entitled to 3 openings of the gate in a single season before the Bureau may rule the release failed. That law is older than your standard, Provost. It's older than the Bureau. The herd wardens wrote it when your office was a tent. She turned and looked across the ground, past the dead Karg, to where the old man stood with his hand on the storm-gray mane, watching them with the patience of a man who had spent his life waiting on seeds. This was the first opening. The subject did not refuse the Wild. The Wild sent a Karg into a crowd of civilians, and the subject handled it because somebody raised her to. I am recording Attempt 1 as interrupted by Bureau negligence in the placement of the gallery and the offering. I have 2 gates left and a season to use them, and I will use them. For a long moment the Provost looked at her, and Seja looked back, herd stock eyes against Hunter's politics, and the drones drank it all. 2 gates, Warden, Huel said at last, soft as ash. And when the second one fails, and the third one fails, and they will, because I have 20 years of data that says a hand-raised apex never stops. Choosing its human, I will be standing at that stone with a containment writ, and your warrant will be the second thing I file. The Bureau built the severance standard on the graves of people who believed exactly what you believe. I watched a hand-raised Drath open a handler's throat with love in its eyes. So I will say this once for your record and mine. He leaned in. A bond is not a gift you give an animal. It is a debt you saddle it with. And the kindest thing this office ever learned to do is cut it clean. He turned in a swirl of gray formal coat and began issuing transport orders, and the ceremony ground broke into motion around him. Drones lifting, magistrates herded toward vehicles, the honor guard finally discovering their feet, and Seja Vale stood alone on the bloodied white grass of her own range and let the shaking arrive now that it could do no harm. Then she walked across the ground to the rope line, where the most dangerous animal on the roan sweep was leaning against a horticulturist. Dane Mercer watched her come. Up close, he was lean and sun-cured, with pale eyes set in a net of squint lines and soil worked so deep into the seams of his hands that no sense-stripping protocol on any world would ever get it out, which Seja thought was rather the whole of the problem and rather the whole of the point. Sorrel's nose came around to read her, and Seja stood still for it, hands loose, the way you stand for an apex, and felt the warm air of the animal's breath go up her sleeve and along her jaw, taking her apart scent by scent and filing her somewhere. The mane stayed down. She had been filed under harmless. From a sythar, it was a compliment that left a bruise. That man wants her dead in a room, Dane said. He said it the way he said everything Seja would learn. Level, unhurried, with the heat banked so deep you could warm your hands on it and never find the fire. Calls it an annex. There's no grass in it, I asked. He wants his doctrine alive, Seja said. He doesn't think about it all. That's worse, and it's also the only reason we have a chance. She looked down at Sorrel, at the blood drying on the slate and tawny shoulder that had turned 400 kilos of ambush off a crowd, and then out at the open gate at the unfenced rolling gold to the rim of the world, and she made herself say the rest of it, because somebody on this range had to say true things out loud, or the Bureau's version would be the only one in the record. Mr. Mercer, you should hear it from a warden and not from a form. The Provost is wrong about what she is, but he is not wrong about the gate. She went through a cark to get to your hand. If we can't teach her to want the grass more than she wants your fire, the third gate will fail, and the writ will be waiting, and everything you did for her ends in the Calden Annex behind glass. Seja let her ears fold flat, which among her people is how you bow. I have 2 gates in 1 season. I intend to spend both on her, but I won't lie to you about the price. The price is that we win. The price is that she leaves and doesn't look back, and you stand at the stone and let her. The old man was quiet for a while. The wind came up off the sweep and moved the grass in long silver breaths, and the animal between them lifted her head into it, mane half rising, reading the country she had been born in and taken from, and was now, by the full machinery of an interstellar bureaucracy, being begged to want. Warden, Dane said at last, I've been letting things go my whole life. Seedlings out of the nursery rows, whole orchards out of quarantine, into open soil, knowing the frost gets some. You don't grow a thing because you get to keep it. He scratched once gently at the base of the storm gray mane, and the deadliest animal on the roan sweep rumbled like a kettle and shut her eyes. I never once expected to keep her. I just refused to let them teach her that loving us was a mistake. You show me how to let her go without that lie in it, and you'll find I'm easier to work with than my file says. Seja unfolded her ears slowly. 11 seasons on the sweep, 41 releases under her warrant. She had stood at the stone with handlers who wept, handlers who bargained, handlers who had to be removed by escort, and she had read every page of the Severance Standard so many times she could recite the schedules and sleep, and not once in all of it had any of them, beast or person or bureau, said anything that sounded like that. Then we start over, she said. Forget everything the Standard did to her in the last 30 days. The strangers, the stripping, the silent gate. We're done cutting cords. She looked at the open gate and passed it. Attempt 2, we do it the old way the herd wardens did it before there were forms. We take her out into the unfenced, all of us together, and instead of severing the bond, Seja took a breath. Hearing her own warrant creak under the weight of what she was about to put on it, we teach it to carry. Above them, the last recorder drone wheeled once and fled west with its evidence, and the gate to the wild stood open on its pins, unwatched, unphotographed, and patient, the way the wild has always been patient, knowing it would get its daughter back in the end, knowing the only question left was what she would be allowed to bring with her. The inquiry convened by wire 2 days later, because the Bureau never missed a chance to hold a meeting about a thing instead of doing the thing. Seja took it standing in the operations room of Threshold Station 6, a low rammed earth building that smelled of dust and lamp oil and 40 years of warden's tea, with the gate sergeant pretending to inventory pins in the corner so he could listen. The wall screen carried 2 faces. One was Provost Huell's, composed now, crest-groomed, framed by the white offices of the Bureau's district seat, with the Karg footage already edited into exhibits behind him. The other was older, broader, and gray mauve like Seja's own. Director Farun Oza, head of the Office of Wild Integrity for the entire Madhouse circuit, half-blind, herdstock, 81 years old, who had been a range warden on 3 worlds before most of her current subordinates were born, and who was the only being in the chain of command that Provost Huell had ever been observed to address carefully. Huell presented for 40 minutes. He was good. Seja gave him that the way you give a storm its due. The car kill became an unsanctioned lethal event in a civilian zone. The leap over the transfer wall became a containment failure with mass casualty potential. The walk to Dane's rope line, the quiet sit, the hand on the mane, all of it played on the screen in slow loops, while Hewley's voice moved over it like a surgeon's pointer. Fixation on the handler, severance rejection, weaponized imprinting. 20 years of data went up in charts. Hand-raised apex subjects, release outcomes, incident rates. He finished where Seja had known he would finish, with the scar. He laid his thin gray hand flat against his own collar, where the old wound showed at the edge of the formal coat, and he said, "Director, I have given my career to one finding. The bond is the hazard. Affection in an apex predator is ordnance with a timer. The standard exists because we buried people who believed otherwise, and I carried one of them to the yard myself. I am asking the circuit to enforce its own doctrine. Rule the release failed, remand the subject, and review the warrant of the warden who obstructed." The screen held silence for a moment. Director Oza's clouded eye drifted. Her good one did not move from Seja. "Warden Vale," she said, "you invoke the threefold gate. On the record, in front of 3 districts. I haven't heard a warden invoke the threefold gate since I was the warden doing it." "Speak, Director," Seja said, and put her hands flat on the table, and spoke. "The Provost data is honest. I've read all of it tonight, twice. Hand-raised apex releases fail. 7 in 10 come back to the fence line within a season. Of the rest, half die because they hunt like orphans. Those numbers are true." On the screen, Huell's crest settled half a degree, the way a player relaxes when an opponent concedes the board. But I pulled the case files behind the numbers, and every release in that dataset was conducted under the Severance Standard. Everyone. 30 days of strangers, scent stripping, the silent gate. We have spent 20 years teaching these animals that the bond ends in abandonment, and then recording, with great scientific care, that they are desperate and confused. The data doesn't say the bond is the hazard, Director. The data says severance is. We have never once tested the alternative, because the standard forbids the test. "There is no alternative," Huell said. "Sentiment is not a protocol. The herd wardens had one," Seja said. "It's in the oldest code, the part the Bureau kept for ceremony and stopped reading. The gate opens 3 times because the going was never meant to happen in one day. The first gate, the beast learns the country. The second gate, the beast learns its kind. The third gate, the beast chooses, and the handler stands at the stone for all 3, because the code says, And I am quoting the old text director. You may check my translation. The bond is the rope by which the wild is climbed. You don't cut a climbing rope because you've reached the ledge. You carry it up. She took a breath. I am asking for the season the code already grants. Attempt 2 under my method on my warrant, documented end to end. If the third gate fails, the provost gets his writ and my warrant with it. I'll hand him both. Unsupervised, Huell said, on an open range with a proven lethal subject and a sentimental civilian. The circuit supervised, Director Oza said, by the office that loses either way. Provost, you'll embed 2 observers of your choosing with the field party. They document everything. If Warden Vale's method fails, you will have the best evidenced failure of your career and a doctrine no one will ever question again. If it succeeds, the circuit learns something worth more than a ceremony. Her good eye finally moved to Huell, and her voice went dry as the sweep in Firewatch season. You taught us all that the public must witness, Casimir. Witness. The screen went dark on Huell's stiff bow, and the gate sergeant in the corner let out a long breath over his tray of pins, and Seja discovered her ears had been flat to her skull for the better part of an hour. She drove out to the Mercer seed station the next morning to meet the animal she had just bet her warrant on. The station sat in the lee of a long ridge 2 hours east of the threshold, 40 hectares of nursery rows and wind fences and grafted orchard stock, all of it leaning slightly away from the prevailing weather like everything else on Maddow. Dane met her at the cattle grid. Sorrel met her a half-second later, flowing up out of the irrigation ditch where she had been lying in the cool mud, and Seja stood for the reading again, the warm breath up the sleeve, the unhurried catalog, and was filed again. And only then did the storm-gray mane settle and the amber-green eyes lose interest in her entirely. She does that to everything that comes through the gate, Dane said. Seed trucks, inspectors. The postal drone gave her some trouble the first year. She filed it eventually. He turned up the track toward the house. Come see where the Bureau's weapon grew up. What Seja saw, walking the rows with the morning warming around them, went into her field log in the dry words of her trade, and underneath the dry words it went into her like water into cracked ground. She saw a 4-year-old apex predator pace a nursery row exactly 1 stride out from the seedlings, never once crossing the line of the planting, because somewhere in her cubhood, a man with soil in his hands had taught her where feet went and where they did not. She saw Sorrel freeze at the edge of the seed-cleaning shed, look back and wait, and not move until Dane said, "Go on," because doors were asked through, not taken. At the noon feeding, Seja watched the old man set down a pan of cold meat and watched the animal sit, mane flat, a thread of drool the length of a hand swinging from her jaw, and not touch it, not until the whistle. 2 notes, low then high. Dane could put the pan down and walk the length of the row and back. The pan was law, and the whistle was the gate to the law. Bureau called that fixation, Dane said, watching her eat, wrote it in the file. Subject displays abnormal dependence on auditory release cues. It isn't dependence, Seja said quietly. She had her recorder running. She wanted Huell's observers to inherit every word. It's relay law. Dane looked at her, and she crouched and put her hand on the warm slate shoulder, feeling the engine in it, and explained what every Thuscan child learned before their second reigns, and what the Bureau's whole library somehow did not contain. Wild sythar hunt in relays. 6-8 runners strung out across 10 kilometers of grass. The first runner turns the prey. The second runs it. The third takes the kill. And then Mr. Mercer, 300 kilos of predator, stands over meat it brought down itself, starving and waits, because the kill belongs to the line, not the runner, and the matriarch calls the feed in order. Cubs first, then the old, then the runners in reverse order of their work. A sythar that eats out of turn gets driven off the line, and a sythar off the line starves by winter. The discipline isn't what you trained into her. Seja stood and found that something at the back of her ribs had come loose and was hurting in an unfamiliar, hopeful way. It's what she was born carrying, and you spoke to it. The whistle, the waiting, the feed in order, you first, her second. Provost Huell looked at this animal and saw a weapon with a favorite person. You raised a runner who thinks she's on a line, holding for the call. The only thing she's missing is the line. Dane was quiet for a moment, looking down the long silver rows at the ridge and the open gold beyond it. Old Brindle, he said. The roan matriarch, Seja said. Sweep Alpha on the registry. Her line runs 11 runners this season, denned up in the gulch country north of the bluffs, 3 good litters in 4 years. She let her ears tip forward, which among her people is how you smile. The best wild line on the circuit, 2 days' ride from the porch where your weapon learned to wait for a whistle. Attempt 2 isn't a gate, Mr. Mercer. It's an introduction. They left on the morning of a clear day with the season's first cold in it, a small party going north into the unfenced where the maps stopped pretending to be useful. Seja on the lead crawler with the field kit and her warren, Dane on the second with the camp gear and a crate of grafted rootstock he refused to. Leave to the frost and 2 bureau observers in a gray utility rig behind, an Offert records officer named Tessick and a thick-shouldered Offert containment tech named Vorley, both chosen by Huel, both polite, both recording everything, like a pair of unblinking gray weather vanes pointed permanently at failure. Sorrel ran beside the crawlers, not behind, not ahead. Holding station off Dane's left wheel at a working trot she could have kept up from one ocean to the other, mane half-raised the whole way, reading her country coming home to her one ridge at a time. That night they made the first camp under the bluffs, and Seja sat by the fire writing the day into the log while Dane fried meal cakes in a pan, older than the colony, and Sorrel lay at the light's edge with her chin on her crossed forelegs, eyes going from the man to the dark and the dark to the man, on watch without anyone having asked, because nobody had ever needed to ask. "Warden," Tessick said from the other fire, pen poised, perfectly courteous. "For the record, what is the method's first step?" Seja looked at the animal at the edge of the light, and past her, north, where somewhere in the Gulch country 11 wild runners slept in a heap with their cubs against the coming cold. "Step 1, she said. "We stop being her whole world. Starting tomorrow, we teach her the thing the Severance Standard never taught anybody." She closed the log. How to be from 2 places. Far off that first night, as the fire burned down to coals, a sound came south on the wind, low and carrying, a deep drummed pulse out of the Gulch country, the relay call of wild sythar passing a hunt between runners under the moons. At the edge of the light, Sorrel's head came up off her forelegs and her ears stood, and her mane rose, full, and she held perfectly still for the length of 10 heartbeats, listening to the first voice of her own kind she had heard since the flood took her, birthline in her first month of life. She did not answer it, not that night. She looked at Dane, and the old man looked back at her over the dying fire and nodded once, as if something had been asked and granted, and she put her chin back down on her forelegs and went on watching the dark. In the gray rig, a record was made. Day 1. Subject oriented to wild conspecific vocalization, 11 seconds. Did not respond. Returned attention to handler. Severance incomplete. In Seja's log by the same firelight, a different record. Day 1 she heard them. She told him. He told her there was time. Attempt 2 begins tomorrow, and for the first time in 11 seasons, I believe the old code knew something we forgot. The second gate did not open on a ceremony. It opened on a dead Bruin yearling at dawn on the 3rd day, and it opened crooked. Sorrel killed it alone, clean, a quarter-hour's run from camp, and Seja arrived on the crawler to find the whole problem of the release laid out in the grass like a diagram. The kill was perfect. The take was textbook, throat and weight, the work of an animal whose body remembered 10,000 generations of the trade. And the killer was sitting beside it, not eating, mane flat, drooling her patient thread, looking south toward camp, waiting for a whistle that was a quarter-hour away, and a man who had no idea she had, connected. "There it is," Seja said softly, to the recorder, to herself, to the gray rig rolling up behind her with its lenses already out. "She can feed a line. She just doesn't know she's allowed to be the line." The observers logged it their way. Subject made unsupervised kill, then exhibited handler-dependent feeding paralysis. 11 minutes, until handler arrived and issued auditory cue. They were not wrong. That was the thing about Hooley's people, Seja thought. Watching Vorley measure the drag marks with a calibrated tape, they were never wrong, the way a fence post is never wrong. Dane came up on the second crawler, took one look, and did not whistle. He stood beside the kill with his hat in his hands like a man at a graveside, and he said, "Whose is it, girl?" And Sorrel looked at him, and looked at the meat, and looked at him, and the old man turned his back on the kill and walked away from it, 10 paces, 20, and sat down in the grass facing the other direction. It took the animal 4 minutes to decide the law had changed. Seja had it all on the recorder, the main slow half-rise, the question, the single step toward the man's turned back, the stop, the long look north toward the Gulch country, and then, in the manner of every door she had ever been asked through, Sorrel made a sound Seja had never heard from her, a short, low drum, 1 beat, the smallest unit of the relay call, the syllable that wild runners use on the line to say mine now, and 8. Dane's shoulders did not move while she fed. But Seja was watching his face, and what was on it was not grief and was not pride and was both. And that was the day she began to understand that the work they had come north to do was going to be done twice, once in the animal and once in the man, and that the second job was the harder one, because nobody had bred the man for it. They built the routine the way you build any wild thing, out of repetition and weather. Sorrel hunted at dawn alone, further each day. The party moved camp north along the bluffs in slow stages, deeper into the unfenced, until the seed station was a week behind them, and the Gulch country a smudge of broken land on the forward horizon. And every evening, with the regularity of a tide, the test came south on the wind, the wild line running the Dutsk relays, drumming the hunt across the grass. 11 voices. Seja taught Dane to read them by the fire the way her grandmother had taught her. The deep-paired pulse of old Brindle herself, calling the order. The lighter triplets of the young runners, the flat single beats of a kill claimed and a feed begun. Sorrel listened every night, mane full, body trembling sometimes with the effort of stillness. And every night she stayed, and the observer's log grew a column of identical entries. Severance incomplete, severance incomplete, severance incomplete, like a clerk hammering the same nail. On the 12th night, Seja took the kettle off the fire, and then, instead of banking the coals the way she had banked them every night of her working life, she put the fire out. Dane looked up from his pan. "Frost tonight, Warden?" "There is," Seja said. "And there will be frost on the Gulch country, too, and no fire in it, and 11 runners sleeping warm anyway, in a pile, the way her kind have slept since before either of our kinds could make a flame." She nodded at Sorrel, lying at the camp's edge with her chin on her forelegs, watching the man the way she watched him every night, which was the way a lighthouse keeper watches a lamp. "Look at her and tell me what the fire is, Mr. Mercer." "It isn't warmth, she carries her own. It's the pin in the map. As long as the fire is lit, the world has a center, and the center is us." The wild line drums her an invitation every dusk, and every dusk she checks the coals and stays. So tonight the camp goes cold. Seja folded her ears flat against the thing she was about to say, because she had promised him truth at the rope line, and the promise was coming due, early. And it stays cold, every night from here, until the dark on our side of the grass looks no different from the dark on theirs. Tessik's pen stopped scratching at the other camp. Even the observers understood they were watching doctrine being written. Dane looked at the coals for a while. Then he reached out with the flat of the pan and crushed the last of the glow himself deliberately, an old man volunteering his own lighthouse for decommission. And in the sudden enormous starlight of the steppe, Seja heard him say, mild as ever, "Hear that, girl? Nothing to mind here. Go look at the night." She did not go that night. She went 4 nights later, and she went the way wild things go, which is that between one watch and the next she was simply not there, and Seja put a hand on Dane's shoulder in the dark and would not let him stand. And the two of them sat in the cold, listening to the dusk relay come south. 11 voices, and then a pause in the pattern, a hole in the rhythm, the length of held breath, and then far off, faint, one voice more. The line did not take her. Seja had never expected it would, not at once, and she spent the gray of that dawn glassing the gulch approaches with her heart in her ears until the scope found the story written in the trampled frost half a kilometer out. Sorrel, returning south, gait stiff with humiliation, a fresh notch torn in her left ear and dried blood crusting the storm-gray mane at the shoulder, escorted to the edge of her own scent line by 2 wild runners who peeled away the moment the camp came in view, like marshals returning a foreigner to a border. She came into camp small, mane down, and folded herself against Dane's legs, and the old man, who had been told twice by Seja not to fuss her wounds unless they went deep, examined the ear with 2 fingers and the gravity of a consulting physician and said, "Well, you found the door. Nobody finds the handle the first time," and went back to his pan, and the animal sighed like a bellows and slept till noon. The observers logged a conspecific aggression event, subject driven off, prognosis poor. Seja logged the truth, which was older and stranger. The line had not driven her off. The line had walked her home. You did not escort what you had decided was prey, and you did not waste 2 runners on what you had decided was nothing. The wild had opened a file on her. The wild was deciding. What the wild was deciding became clear over the next 20 days. In the slow grammar that Seja glassed from the ridge each dawn and pieced, together each night by a fire they no longer lit. Sorrel went north every second darkness, then every darkness. She came back notched and stiff, then just stiff, then neither. The escort stopped peeling away at the scent line and began standing a while, half a kilometer out, watching the camp, and Seja lay in the frost on the ridge with her scope and watched the watchers, young runners mostly, a long-legged dun female with a kinked tail, a heavy dark male with 1 white forefoot, the yearling delegation of a polity conducting foreign relations in the only language it had. One dawn she watched Sorrel run a relay with 3 of them, not invited exactly but not driven, holding the 4th position, the trailing slot where a line carries its novices and its convalescents, turning a brune cow into the kill ground, with a competence that made the dun female's head swing round in what Seja would have sworn before the bureau was surprised. The kill was made by the white-footed male. Sorrel stopped 30 paces out, sat, and waited her turn at a wild line's meet for the first time in her life. And when the feed order call came back down the line, last position, novice's share, she answered it with the 1-beat drum, "Mine now," and ate among her own kind in the pink of the morning while a Thescan warden lay on a frozen ridge a kilometer south, crying quietly into a scope, on the record, and entirely unashamed of it. 2 mornings after the relay, the door swung the other way, and it was the meat that swung it. Sorrel made her dawn kill far out, a brune calf taken clean on the flats, and instead of feeding where it fell, she did the thing the observer's manual had no column for. She opened the carcass, took the shoulder, and carried it. Seja tracked her by scope the whole long road home, 4 kilometers of steppe with 20 kilos of meat swinging from her jaws, and felt her own heart sink with every stride because she knew what she was watching. The pan law, the oldest law of the porch. Food comes home, the man releases it, then you eat. 40 days into the wild, with a wild line half one, the animal was still carrying her kills to the center of her world, and the center of her world was an old man's feet. She laid the shoulder down in front of Dane like a tax, and Dane Mercer looked at it for a long moment, and then did the second hardest thing Seja ever watched him do. He did not whistle. He picked the shoulder up, both hands, staggering slightly with it, walked it north past the camp line and set it down again in the open grass facing the gulch country and stood back and said, "Not mine, girl. I've a pan and a pantry and an old man's appetite. But I'll tell you who's short this season." He nodded north, the way he'd nod a visitor toward the kitchen. 3 litters and a hungry year coming. Yearlings eat last on a line, you told me, Warden, so go on. You know who eats after cubs and elders. Go and be the one who brings it. The animal stood over the shoulder, reading him, mane half up, the question hanging. Then she took the meat up again and went north with it at the working trot, and Seja got the scope on the far ridge in time to see the handoff enter the record of the country. The dun female meeting her at the scent line, the yearlings boiling down the slope, and sorrel hand-raised, porch-lawed, pan-trained, standing back off her own kill with her mane flat while wild cubs she had not born ate first, in order, the way somebody at a feed pan had taught her was the whole shape of love. "Tessic," Seja said, not lowering the scope. "Column for that?" A long pause from the gray rig. "I've entered it as provisioning behavior toward wild conspecifics," the records officer said. And then, in a tone Seja had not heard from him in 40 days, almost reluctant, entirely unprofessional. "My grandmother fed half our stairwell through the lean years, Warden. I am aware there is no column for what that is." That was the week the observers began to bend. Not their records, never their records. Huell had chosen well, and the log of violations grew its careful daily teeth. But Vorl, the containment tech, started leaving his stun lance racked in the rig when he walked the camp, which in the grammar of his profession was a confession of state. And one cold dusk, Seja caught him at the north edge, lens down, just watching the relay run the far ridge in the last light. And when she stood beside him, he said, without turning, "I've crated 41 of these for the annex, Warden. You know what they do the first night behind the glass? They drum, all night. I always told myself it was distress." He racked his jaw shut for a moment. "It's not, is it? It's that." The relay rolled gold along the ridge, voice to voice to voice. "They're calling positions for a line that never answers. For years. We file it under adjustment." "Put that in your record too," Seja said quietly. "It wouldn't survive review. Then put it somewhere that will." "She has a foot in the door," Seja told Dane that night, in the cold dark that had stopped feeling like deprivation and started feeling like a held breath. "But understand what the door is. The line doesn't add runners for charity. Brindle is old, the registry has her at 14, and her lead daughter died in the spring floods, the same floods that nearly drowned the gulch dens. The line is one good runner short, and the matriarch knows it. That's the opening. The price of the door is that she has to be worth it to them, every day, forever, with no whistle and no pan and no porch. And there is one test left that matters more than hunting." She looked north, where the broken land lay silver under the moons, and named the thing the way her grandmother would have named it. "The cubs. A line lives or dies by whether every runner on it will stand for the cubs. Brindle has 3 litters denned in that gulch and a flood-hungry season coming. Until the old queen has seen with her own eyes what your girl does when the cubs are in the wind, she hasn't seen anything at all." Dane was quiet, sharpening the field knife he never used on anything fiercer than rootstock. "And there's no way to show her," he said. "You can't stage that." "No," Seja said. "The wild sets its own exams on its own calendar, and the only thing the syllabus guarantees is that everyone in the country gets the same one." She did not know, saying it, that the exam was already moving toward all of them, that it had been moving for days, the way bad weather moves, from far off, on a schedule no office on Maddow had approved. It announced itself first as absence. The dusk relays, which had run 11 voices and then 12, went silent for 2 nights running, and Sorrel paced the camp's edge in the dark, drumming short questions north and getting grass noise back. Then the Brune came through, not in their slow grazing fronts, but in a single pressed column moving south along the bluffs, calves packed to the center, the way herd animals move when the country behind them has acquired a smell they have voted against. And on the 3rd afternoon, The gray rig's long band receiver, which Tessic kept tuned to the bureau weather wire out of off-rit thoroughness, began to chatter about a dry lighting cell building over the high sweep, the kind that came twice a season and set the world on edge without ever quite setting it alight. And Seja stood in the wind, reading the bruised yellow sky to the north, and felt 11 seasons of rangecraft pulled together into a single cold conclusion. It's not the storm, she said. The storm is the cover. Karg hunt the front edge of dry lighting weather, when every nose on the steppe is full of ozone and dust and nothing can smell them coming. The pair that's been ghosting the Brune column will work back along it to whatever the herd was pushed off of. She turned and found Dane already looking at her, because the old man could read a warden's mane as well as a sythar's by now, and the next words were not necessary, and she said them anyway. Into the recorder, for the bureau, for the inquiry she could already feel gathering on the horizon of the season like a second storm. The herd was pushed off the Gulch country, Mr. Mercer. The dens, the exam is tonight. They argued about it in the last of the light, the four of them, while the sky to the north turned the color of an old bruise and the first dry thunder walked its knuckles along the rim of the world. Vorel wanted the party withdrawn to the rig. Tessic wanted a ruling for the record. Was the warden proposing to interfere in a natural predation event? Because Bureau Code prohibited interference in natural predation events, and he would be obliged to cite. Dane wanted, with a quietness that was worse than shouting, to know what the point of a stun lance was if it spent the night on a rack. And Seja stood in the rising wind and made the hardest call of her career, and made it the way her grandmother's people had always made the hard ones, out loud so that everyone had to live with having heard it. Nobody interferes, she said. Not me, not the lance, and not you, Mr. Mercer. And here is why, and Tessic, you cite every word of this. The line is deciding whether she's one of theirs. If we ride in tonight and fight her fight, then whatever the wild sees standing over those dens at dawn, it isn't her, it's us, and the door she spent 40 nights opening closes forever. The exam is hers. The wild wrote it, and the wild grades it, and the cruelest thing about my job is that the code is right about this. She turned and looked at the old man, small and gray in the huge bruised light. We go to the ridge, we watch. Whatever happens in that gulch tonight happens to her among her own kind, as her own kind. That is what release means, and tonight is the night we find out if either of us meant it. Dane looked north for a long moment. The wind off the front smelled of ozone and scorched dust, and under it, faint, the carrion smell of the things using the storm for a cloak. Warden, he said, when I found her, she was a month old, half drowned, hanging onto a fence brace in 2 meters of floodwater, and the only reason I heard her over the storm was that she'd stopped crying and started drumming. Little thing like a heartbeat in the dark. He pulled his hat down. I pulled her out of one storm. I suppose I owe her the dignity of not pulling her out of this one. Sorrel left them at full dark. She had been pacing the camp's north edge since dusk, drumming her short questions into a silence that had stopped answering, and then the first real lightning broke over the Gulch country, and in its white instant, Seja saw her already gone. Already a low line of intent flowing north through the grass, and the night swallowed her, and there was nothing left to do but climb. The ridge above the gulch was 2 kilometers of broken scree that they made in 40 minutes, the crawlers abandoned at the base, the observers hauling their lenses, Dane climbing with a steadiness that shamed them all. From the crest, the den country opened below in stuttering frames of lightning. The gulch a black crack in the silver land, the brood terraces at its head where 4 years of litters had been whelped in the soft flood-cut banks, and the shapes, fast and low, moving wrong, moving everywhere. Seja got the night scope up and the night assembled itself into sense, and the sense was bad. 2 Kargs, she said. Big pair. They've split the line. The wild runners were strung across the approaches in a defense that was textbook and failing, because the defense was built for 1 threat and the threats were 2, and every lightning frame showed it more clearly. The heavy dark male Kark holding 6 runners in a standoff at the gulch mouth, drawing the line strength downhill, while its mate worked the long way around the terraces, patient and wide and gray as wet slate toward the dens. Toward the cubs, packed in the highest bank with the yearling standing over them. Old Brindle stood at the terrace edge, 14 years old, scarred like a chopping block, the deep paired pulse of her command drum rolling off the rocks between thunders, calling her line into an arithmetic that did not work, and Seja watched the old queen make the matriarch's choice, the only choice, which was to leave the mouth thin and pull 2 runners back up to the dens, and she watched the male Kark feel the line thin in front of it and begin with terrible patience to press. It's a work trap, Dane said quietly. He had the second scope. They've done this before, those 2. They're farming her dens. Yes, Seja said. And then the lightning came again and she stopped talking, because the frame it froze for her was Sorrel arriving. She came up the gulch from the south at the full-reaching stride, past the standoff at the mouth, past the startled flank of her own embattled line, and she did not stop at the terraces, and she did not stop at the dens. She went through the dens, one bound, placing her on the high bank above the packed cubs, above the bristling yearlings, on the exposed shelf where the bank gave the climbing female cark its one approach, and she turned on that narrow shelf to face the thing coming up out of the dark. And she opened her chest and answered old Brindle's failing arithmetic with the loudest sound Sejah had ever heard an animal make. It was not the relay call. It was the other drum, the one Sejah had read about in her grandmother's books and never once heard in 11 seasons on. The range, the den stand, the line holder's vow, the signal that means this position does not move. Route everything else around the fact of me. The books said Sythar gave it perhaps twice in a lifetime because it was not a tactic, it was a spend. A runner who drummed the den stand had taken itself off the board as a runner and become a wall, and walls did retreat, and every animal in the gulch, wild line and carg both, understood the sound in its bones the moment it rolled off the banks, and so, watching through a scope 2 kilometers south with her heart slamming, did a Thescan warden, and so she saw when she could bear to glance sideways, did an old human horticulturist who had heard that same drum once before in 2 meters of floodwater from a dying cub who had decided a month old that she was not done. The female carg came up the bank anyway. Carg did not read poetry. What followed, the scope gave Sejah in fragments between darknesses, and the fragments were the worst hour of her life. Sorrel took the first rush head-on and turned it off the shelf, and was opened along the left flank doing it. She took the second rush low and broke something in the carg's foreleg, and was driven half off the bank, and held by her claws and came back up. Between rushes she stood over the den mouth with her blood blackening the flood-cut earth, mane full, flank heaving, drumming the den stand steady as a pulse, and the yearlings packed in behind her in the dark with the cubs beneath them. And below at the gulch mouth the wild line heard their wall holding and turned its whole arithmetic around the holding of it. Old Brindle pulled everything to the mouth. 6 runners hit the male carg as one animal. And when the heavy gray shape finally broke and ran for the storm with the line at its haunches, the old queen came up the terraces herself, alone, at a speed that had no business in a 14-year-old frame, and arrived on the high bank like the judgment of the country. The female carg, 3-legged now, bleeding, pressed once more because a farm does not surrender its harvest. What old Brindle and Sorrel did to it then, together, the old queen low and the young wall high, finished the question in less than a minute, and the last lightning of the passing front showed Sejah the 2 of them standing over it in the rain that had finally, uselessly, begun to fall. The matriarch and the foreigner, shoulder to bloody shoulder above the dens, and the cubs already boiling up out of the bank to swarm the legs of both of them without distinguishing. Because cubs are not bureaucrats, and safety smells like whoever bled for it. "She's down," Dane said. Sejah swung the scope back. Sorrel had held the shelf through the killing and through the swarming of the cubs, and then, with the precision of a machine that has completed its task list, she folded. Down the long lens, Sejah watched her try to rise, organize her legs with enormous care, and fail, and lie still on the high bank in the rain with the left flank wound sheeting darker than rainwater should allow. And the cold ridge went colder. Deep laceration, maybe the big vessel nicked, Sejah said, already moving, already sliding down the wet scree toward the crawlers with her ears flat to her skull. "If it's the vessel, she has an hour. Field kit's on my rig. Warden." Tessik's voice behind her raised over the rain for the first time in 40 days, not unkind, doing the only job it had been sent to do. Physical contact with the subject during a live release window voids the attempt under the severance appendix. If you treat that animal, attempt 2 is failed on handler interference grounds, and the provost, "Cite it," Sejah said, and kept moving. "He'll take her, Sejah." It was the first time the observer had ever used her name. "He'll take them both." "Then he takes them," she said, alive and dropped into the dark. What happened at the dens in the gray of that dawn went into 4 records. Tessik's, Vorla's, Sejah's, and the country's, and 3 of the 4 agreed. The crawler could not climb the gulch, so they went up the last kilometer on foot, the warden and the old man, the field kit slung between them, walking by choice straight into the heart of a wild sythar line at first light on a morning of blood which was, by every page of every manual the Bureau had ever printed, a way to get 2 more bodies into the report. The line came out of the rain mist to meet them at the foot of the terraces. 11 runners, the dun female, the white-footed male, all of them between the strangers and the dens, mane up silent, and Sejah stopped and stood for the reading with her hands open. And the line did not read her, it read Dane. They came up the way Sorrel had come up at the cattle grid. The first day, one at a time, the warm breath up the sleeve and along the jaw, taking the old man apart cent by cent, The soil in his hands, the pan smoke in his coat, the 40 days of cold camps, and threaded through all of it like a wire through cloth, 4 years of her. The runner on the bank, the wall who held their dens, whose whole body was a map of this man, whose drum they had first heard answering south toward his fire. The dun female stood the longest, nose at the old man's wrist, the wrist that had pulled a drowning cub off a fence brace before any of this year's runners were whelped. Then she stepped out of the path, and the line stepped with her, and the way to the dens stood open. And Dane Mercer walked up through 11 wild apex predators with his hat in one hand and the kit strap in the other, mild as morning, murmuring good mornings to each of them as he passed like a man moving down a pew. Sorrel was conscious on the high bank, just. Old Brindle stood over her and did not move when they came, and so the field surgery was conducted in the rain light, under the direct supervision of the roan matriarch, her great scarred head hanging a hand's breadth above Seja's working hands, watching every clamp and stitch go into her wall's open flank, and Seja would write in her log that she had performed procedures under bureau inspectors with less composure. It was the vessel, nicked, not cut. She tied it off with the rain dripping off her own folded ears, and packed and closed the wound, and the animal under her hands lay still for all of it, with her chin across drumming, very softly, very slowly, the one beat, over and over, mine now, which Seja realized somewhere in the middle of the work was not about the meat and had never been about the meat. When it was done, when Sorrel had been lifted by 6 hands and one queen's careful jaws into the dry of the den bank to sleep, when the kit was packed and there was nothing left on the high bank but the rain and the watching line, old Brindle came and stood in front of the old man. For a long time the matriarch read him, the clouded old eyes a hand from his face, and the country held its breath. Then she stepped past him deliberately to the den mouth and reached in and brought out a cub, a slate and tawny female, a month old with her storm mane still in its kitten fuzz, dangling resigned from the queen's mouth in the universal manner of carried cubs everywhere, and she crossed the bank and set the cub down on the ground, once directly on Dane Mercer's boots. Then she picked her up again and carried her back inside. Tessick, who had climbed the gulch after them and stood lens up in the rain recording the entire dawn, lowered the camera for the first time in 40 days. "Warden," he said, almost humbly. "Query for the record, what was that?" Seja had to wait until she could trust her voice, because among her grandmother's people there was a word for what that was, and the word was old, and she had never expected to need it on a working range. "That was an introduction," she said. "The queen just showed her line where the cub's name comes from." She watched the old man stare at his boots in the rain like a man who had been handed a medal by a foreign government, and she keyed her recorder and entered the only line of the entire season she would never afterward be able to read aloud steadily. Attempt 2, day 41. The wild has met the bond, examined it, and filed it under kin. Severance was always the wrong question. End of entry. The Bureau's answer arrived 11 hours later, while Sorrel slept healing in the den bank of a wild line that had stopped being foreign, and it arrived the way the Bureau always arrived, in perfect grammar on 3 channels at once. Office of Wild Integrity, Maddow Circuit. Ruling on subject R12. Attempt 2 is ruled failed. Handler contact and medical intervention during live window, severance appendix 4. Subject to be recovered to threshold station 6 for the 3rd and final gate. To be conducted as a public thresholding under full ceremonial protocol, presiding officer, Provost C. Huell. Confiscation writ issued and held in abeyance pending outcome. Recovery team dispatched. Dane read it twice, by the light of the first fire they had permitted themselves in a month, and looked up at Seja across the flames, and for the only time that season, she saw the banked heat in him come all the way to the surface. "He's making her do it in front of a crowd again," he said. The man watched her hold a den against 2 carg, and his answer is folding chairs. "No," Seja said slowly, reading the ruling a 3rd time, watching the shape of the trap assemble itself out of the courteous sentences. "His answer is the choreography. Look at the protocol annex. Full severance staging for the 3rd gate. Stranger handlers, the silent gate, and the handler of record barred from the ceremony ground. You behind glass in the observation block, Mr. Mercer. Her on the white grass alone, with nothing in the world she knows, and 1 gate, and no second chances, and 20 years of his own data telling him exactly what a hand-raised animal does in that exact arrangement." She folded the message flat. It searches for its person, in front of every recorder on the circuit. He doesn't need her to fail. He needs her to be seen failing, the same way she was seen at the 1st gate. The ceremony is the weapon, it always was. The fire cracked. Out in the dark beyond it north, the dusk relay rolled across the gulch country, 12 voices strong now, and one of the voices was rough-edged and healing in theirs. And it was the worst possible night, Seja thought, to have finally won. Then we'll be ready for the ceremony, Dane said at last mildly, the heat banked back down where he kept it. He turned his hat in his hands, around and around, the way he did when he was grafting something difficult in his head. Warden, the old code, the threefold gate. You told me the first gate is the country, and the second gate is her kind. The hat went still. What does the old text say the third gate is? The choosing, Seja said. Whose? And Seja Vale, warden of the Roan Sweep, sat with that one-word question in the firelight for a long time, because 11 seasons of enforcing other people's doctrine had never once required her to answer it, and the old text, when she walked through it line by line in her grandmother's tongue, did not say what 20 years of bureau choreography had always assumed it said. It did not say the beast chooses the wild. It said, in the oldest, plainest heard warden grammar, with no qualifier the Bureau had any authority to add. At the third gate, the bond chooses its shape. Mr. Mercer, she said softly, I think the man wrote a 20-year doctrine without ever reading the law underneath it. And I think we're going to read it to him, out loud, at his own ceremony. The recovery team came north on the third morning, 2 heavy transports and a containment rig with a reinforced crate bolted to its bed, and what they found waiting for them at the camp under the bluffs was nothing their dispatch orders had prepared them for, which was cooperation. The team leader was a broad, careful Thescan sergeant named Marsk, who had clearly been briefed to expect a barricaded warden and a sentimental, civilian and possibly a lethal subject contesting the ground, and who stood holding his stun lance at parade rest while Seja countersigned the recovery order without argument, and the lethal subject in question, stiff with healing but on her feet, watched him from beside the old man's crawler with her mane perfectly flat. The crate gave them the only bad moment. It sat on the rig's bed with its gate winched up, all bare alloy and drain channels, built to a design that assumed everything that entered it would be fighting, and when the loading ramp went down, Sorrel looked at it, and looked at the 12 armed strangers arranged in a horseshoe, pretending not to hold their breath, and looked at Dane. Don't you make them drag you, girl, the old man said, conversational, walking up the ramp ahead of her and putting his bare hand flat on the alloy. Floor of the thing as if testing soil. It's a poor sort of door, but it's a door. We've been asked through worse. And he stepped aside and whistled. 2 notes, low then high, and 400 kilos of den-holding apex walked up the ramp past 12 stun lances and lay down in the Bureau's crate with her chin on her crossed forelegs, and the only sound on the whole step was Sergeant Marsk, very quietly, clearing his throat. Warden, he said, while his crew ran the winch and pointedly did not look at each other, I've done recovery on 6 of these. I have never seen that. Write it down, Seja said. It's going to matter. The convoy ran south for 2 days. Seja rode the containment rig the whole way, against regulation, on the bench bolted beside the crate, doing her paperwork on her knees where the animal could see her through the mesh, and through the long gold afternoons, she became aware of something traveling with them, north of the track, pacing the convoy along the high ground at the very edge of eyesight. Low shapes in the grass shimmer, strung out in relay order, never closing, never falling behind. She said nothing. But on the second dusk, as the lights of Threshold Station 6 came up out of the plain ahead, the country behind them spoke, one deep-paired pulse rolling down off the bluffs, old Brindle's command drum asking its question across 10 kilometers of darkening land, and inside the crate Sorrel lifted her head and answered through the mesh. 2 flat beats and a rising third, and Seja, whose grandmother had taught her the old drum grammar along with everything else, sat very still over her forms. Position held, the wild had asked. Coming home? And the crate had answered, position held. Wait, Tessic, Seja said to the observer riding the bench opposite. Did your equipment record that exchange? It did, Warden. Keep it somewhere the provost can't reach. The station, when they rolled in, had already stopped being hers. Bureau advanced staff thronged the yards. Ceremony ground had been remown and re-chalked, the folding rows multiplied, a press gallery scaffolded up against the operations building, and floodlit in the center of all of it stood the gate, her gate, flanked now by a viewing platform twice the size of the first one, and a long glass fronted observation block with a fresh stenciled sign that said Handler of Record. The severance choreography had arrived in its full dress. Stranger handlers in gray, scent-neutral coveralls drilled their approach patterns by lamplight, and waiting on the steps of her own operations room, groomed and gracious with the confiscation writ in a document tube under his arm like a marshal's baton, stood Provost Casimir Hoole. Warden Vale, he said, you'll want to review the running order. The thresholding is at noon day after tomorrow. Director Oza is attending in person, as are the district magistrates, the circuit press, and by my invitation, every handler currently appealing a severance ruling on Maddow. His crest inclined, almost kindly, and Seja understood that he was not gloating, which made it worse. He was teaching. They should see this, whichever way it goes. That has always been my entire position. The public must witness. And the running order, Provost? By the book. My book. He handed her the folder. Stranger handlers staged the subject at the transfer pen. The gallery is seated behind the stone line this time. You'll be pleased to note I do read incident reports. At the hour, the ground is cleared and sealed under the first law of the threshold, which I trust the author of so many lectures on the old code can recite. While the gate stands live, no warm blood crosses the stone, Seja said. Beast's ground past the stone, people's ground behind it, and the law binds both directions. It's the oldest line in the whole code, Provost. Older than the gate it guards. The herd wardens called it the one law the wild ever agreed to. Charming, Huel said. Then the silent gate is drawn, the subject is released to the ground, and no voice, no cue, no signal of any kind is offered. 1 hour by the ceremony clock. If the subject crosses the stone into the unfenced and holds the country, the release stands and I will sign the discharge myself, in public, and retire the writ. He paused with the precision of a man who had rehearsed the pause. If the subject instead does what every hand-raised apex in 20 years of circuit data has done, if it refuses the wild and seeks its human, then the third gate is spent, the threefold is exhausted, the writ executes, and the Kaldan Annex receives the subject at my order, in front of every appealing handler on the planet, so that no one ever again has to learn this lesson the way I learned it. He looked at her, and for a moment the official fell away and the old scarred true believer looked out, tired and certain. I take no joy in it, Warden. I want you to know that. I have read your field logs from the north, all of them. Twice, the den stand, the matriarch's cub. It is the finest field record I have seen in 20 years, and it changes nothing. Because every handler who ever buried someone had a record full of miracles right up to the last page. The bond performs until the day it doesn't. The only data point that matters is the gate. On that, Provost, Seja said, taking the folder, we have finally agreed. She found Dane at the transfer pen long after dark. On a feed bucket someone had upturned for him, sitting where the floodlights threw his shadow through the mesh so that the animal inside could lie in it, which she was doing, heeling flank to the ground, watching the bustle of the yards with her old porch dog patience. The stranger handlers had orders to begin scent isolation at dawn. It was, though no form would ever phrase it so, the last night. I keep thinking about the manual they gave me when I started in the nurseries, Dane said without preamble as Seja settled onto the rail. 40 years ago now. There was a chapter on hardening off. You know what that is? You've grown a seedling in glass, in warmth, in safe soil. The day comes to move it to open ground. And the manual said the gravest error of the novice is to believe kindness lies in delay. The plant reads the glass house as the world. Every day you keep it there past readiness, you are not protecting it. You are lying to it. He turned his hat in his hands, around. I've moved 10,000 seedlings to open soil, lost my share to frost, never once lost one to the moving. And I have sat on this bucket half the night trying to understand why this is different. And you know what I've got? The hat stopped. It isn't. That's the thing I can't stand about it, Warden. It isn't different. She's ready. She's been ready since the den stand. The country wants her. The line wants her. That drum the other night, I don't have the grammar, but I have ears. Everything in her life is pointing one direction, and the only thing standing in the road, the only frost left on the whole sweep, he laid one hand flat against his own chest lightly, the way Huel had laid a hand on his scar, is in here. He's right, that gray vulture. Not about her, about me. If she fails at that gate, it won't be the bond that failed her. It'll be that she read my face every day for 4 years, and somewhere in it she learned that the old man can't be left. The floodlights hummed. In the pen, the animal's ears were turned toward his voice, the way they were always turned toward his voice, the way they would be turned toward his voice across a chalked ceremony ground with a silent gate standing open and a doctrine and a writ and 20 years of data waiting on the answer. Mr. Mercer, Seja said at last, every release I have ever conducted, 41 of them, the standard has had me treat that exact fact as the enemy. Strip the scent, bar the handler, starve the cord until it snaps clean. And in 41 releases, I have never once asked the question you just asked, which is the only question the third gate has ever been about. She slid down off the rail and crouched eye level with him and folded her ears flat and said it. She won't leave because leaving means losing you. No animal alive walks out on its line. The provost knows that, and his answer is to convince her the line is already gone. And her answer to that we both watched at the first gate. She goes through a cark to get the line back. There is exactly one piece of grammar in her whole world strong enough to send her across that stone, and it isn't silence, and it isn't severance. Seja looked through the mesh at the amber-green eyes, watching them both out of the dark. It's the feed order, Mr. Mercer. It's the whistle. The line releases its runner. The one thing the choreography forbids is the one thing that works. And the man who wrote the choreography will be standing on that platform with a writ, waiting for me to break his rules so he can take her on a violation instead of a failure." Dane was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Then we'd best not break them," and there was something in the mildness of it, some banked and patient heat, that made Seja look at him sharply, and what she found in the weathered old face was not despair at all, but the expression of a man who has been turning a difficult graft in his head for 2 days and has felt it at last take. "You've thought of something." "I've remembered something," Dane said. "Warden, that first law, the stone line. You told the provost it binds in both directions, and he called it charming and moved on. He would. Man reads every code like he wrote it." He stood and put his hat on, and through the mesh behind him the animal rose too, the two of them moving on one hinge as they always had. "You go get some sleep. And tomorrow, when you've an hour, I want you to walk me through the old text of the thresholding, the herd warden version, every line in your grandmother's grammar, not the Bureau's translation." He smiled then, slow and dry, 63 years of frost and patience in it. "Because if the third gate is the bond choosing its shape, then it seems to me somebody ought to make sure the bond knows the whole menu." They spent the eve of the ceremony in the operations room with the old text between them, the actual text, Seja's grandmother's copy, hand-sewn, drummatation in the margins, and Seja walked the old man through the thresholding line by line the way she had promised, both grammars, while the gate sergeant kept the kettle going and pretended, with 40 years of skill, not to be memorizing every word. "There," Dane said, when she reached lines 9 through 14, and he set his finger on the page the way he set graphs, exactly. "The line that raised it shall come to the stone. Not the handler of record, not the owner, the line that raised it." He looked up. "And the wild does not receive what is abandoned. The wild receives what is given. Warden, his whole standard is a machine for abandoning them correctly. It's written down, in the founding law of his own office, that the machine can't work. It was always written down." "It was always written down," Seja said. "And tomorrow the question is only whether the Bureau will hold still long enough to hear it read." She closed the book. "He controls the running order, the clock, the choreography, and the ruling. We control 14 lines of code and one animal's character. I have seen trials go to power with better odds than ours, Mr. Mercer. I want you braced for that. Oza is 1 vote, the law is old, and Huel has spent 20 years learning how the circuit listens. And she's spent 4 learning how to wait out a frost," Dane said. "I'll back my girl." It was past midnight when Seja walked him to the bunkhouse, and that was when they found the visitors at the transfer pen. Gray coats in the floodlight spill, 5-6 of them, the appealing handlers, the ones Huel had invited to witness the lesson, standing along the mesh in the cold at a careful, lawful distance from the animal none of them had any business with. Seja's hand went to her authority out of pure habit, and then she saw what they were doing, which was nothing. Standing looking, an old Vethkar woman with her hands knotted in her coat, a young human couple, colony dressed, the man's jaw working, a broad Theskin and a stockman's slicker with 3 appeal tags sewn to his sleeve like campaign ribbons. "That's far enough back, friends," Seja said gently, and the old Vethkar woman turned, and her face in the floodlight was the face of every handler at every gate Seja had worked, in 11 seasons. "They took my Resaven pair at midwinter, Warden," she said. "Severance grounds. 8 years I had the raising of them. The Bureau letter said the bond was a welfare hazard, and the kindest course was the clean cut. And I signed, because the letter was from experts." She looked back through the mesh, at Sorrel lying quiet in Dane's long shadow, chin on forelegs, watching the strangers with her old porch patience. Then the circuit wire starts carrying stories out of the north. A den stand, a matriarch's cub set down on a man's boots. And tomorrow the experts are going to stand that animal on white grass and prove to all of us that what we signed was mercy. Her hands tightened in her coat. "We didn't come to make trouble, Warden. We came because if there's going to be a different ending to that story, even once, even one time, on one range we wanted to have stood here the night before it. That's all. We wanted to be able to say we stood here." Seja looked down the row of gray coats in the cold, the whole quiet jury of Huel's invited witnesses, summoned to learn the cost of love and assembling instead, hour by hour, into something the provost had not designed for, and she folded her ears and made them the only promise a warden's warrant allowed. "Tomorrow the gate gets its 3 chances," she said. "Stand where you can see the stone." The morning of the thresholding came up windless and hardlit, the sky scrubbed blue to the rim of the world, and by mid-morning the ceremony ground at Threshold Station 6 held more living souls than the station had seen in its 40 years. The gallery rose full behind the chalk stone line, the press scaffold bristling, the magistrates in their district colors, a block of gray-coated appealing handlers seated together like mourners, Director Faroon Oza in the front row in her plain field coat with her clouded eye and her cane, and at the center of it all, on the white mown grass, the gate open on its pins and the boundary stones running away from it in both directions, old and lichened and indifferent, marking the line where the people's world ended and the unfenced began, gold and empty, rolling north to the bluffs under the morning. Empty, at least, to the gallery. Seja stood her post at the warden's mark with her recorder running and her ears unfolded and read what the gallery could not. Heat shimmer on the second ridge, moving wrong. A brune front 2 kilometers out, drifting sideways off a line of grass it should have loved. The unfenced was not empty. The unfenced had come south in the night, 12 runners strong, and taken up positions in the long gold grass beyond the stones with the patience of a Paladi that had received, through 10 kilometers of dusk air, through mesh in the old drum grammar, an answer worth waiting on. Position held. Wait. At noon exactly, Provost Casimir Hule mounted the platform, and the ground was sealed, and the first law was read aloud in the Bureau's flat translation, and the stranger handlers brought Sorrel out. She came onto the white grass between 2 gray coveralled figures who smelled of nothing, into a silence so engineered it had a texture, and the moment the lead ropes were slipped at the center mark, she did exactly what 20 years of circuit data said she would do, which was to stand entirely still and begin, methodically, to read the world. Seja watched her do it and heard the gallery hold its breath. 1,100 souls watching an apex predator turn in place at the center of a chalk circle, nose working, ears walking the crowd 1 row at a time, and Seja could follow the search as if the animal were narrating it. The gallery. 1,000 strangers. 4 known scents, the gate sergeant, Marsk, Tessic, Vorl filed dismissed. The platform, the gray vulture filed long ago, dismissed. The warden's mark. Seja held a moment, a question asked across 60 paces of grass, where, and Seja kept her hands still, and her eyes soft and gave the animal nothing, because the law of the hour was silence and the whole season now balanced on it. The sweep continued. The operations building, the press scaffold, the observation block. The observation block with its long glass front and its fresh stenciled sign, and behind the glass, small and gray and bareheaded, his hat in his hands, the one scent in the world that was not there to be found because glass returns no scent at all. Sorrel stopped. She looked at the shape of him for a long moment, the way she had looked at the postal drone once, Seja thought wildly, at a thing that resembled a known thing but broadcast none of its truth. And then she did the first thing no dataset had predicted. She did not run to the glass. She sat down where she was, at the dead center of the provost's chalked circle, in front of 1,100 witnesses, and cocked her head at the man-shaped silence behind the window, and drummed at it once softly, the interrogative, the single rising beat she had used at doors her whole life. Not begged, asked, the glass said nothing. Dane Mercer stood behind it with his hat crushed in both hands, and the discipline of 40 days of cold camps holding his face together, saying nothing, signaling nothing, exactly as the choreography required, and on the platform Provost Hula leaned forward over the rail, crest perfectly still, watching his life's doctrine perform. At minute 20, the running order produced its one piece of permitted motion. The protocol annex allowed the stranger handlers a single repositioning, a formal escort of the subject from the center mark to the gate's threshold, in case the animal had failed to notice the door, and 2 gray coveralled figures came onto the white grass with soft leads coiled in their hands and crossed half the distance before Sorrel turned her head and looked at them. That was all. She looked at them. She did not rise, did not bristle, did not lift the mane a single degree. She regarded the 2 approaching figures with the level, patient, cataloging attention of an animal that had killed a Karg in front of 200 people without raising her pulse, and the lead handler stopped walking, as though he had reached the end of his own rope. For a moment, the 2 of them stood marooned in the middle of the ceremony ground, holding their soft leads being read, and the gallery watched an apex predator decline an escort with nothing but a look, and somewhere in the press scaffold a single nervous laugh escaped and was strangled. The lead handler glanced up at the platform. The provost's hand moved, a small, flat-cutting gesture, withdraw, because Casimir Hule had survived 40 years of bureau politics by knowing exactly what a picture looked like before it was taken, and the picture of his standards officers being stared back across their own chalk was not one he intended to gift the circuit. The handlers withdrew, and in the gallery, in the block of gray coats, the old Vethkar woman, who had signed for her Resaven pair because the letter was from experts, rose quietly to her feet and stood, hands knotted in her coat the way one stands for an anthem or a casket. The broad Thescan stockmen stood next. Then the young human couple. No one spoke, no one had to. Row by row, seat by seat, the provost invited witnesses. The assembled signatories of 20 years of clean cuts stood up in silence to watch an animal keep a position none of their animals had been. allowed to keep, and the standing spread beyond the gray coats, a magistrate's aide here, a clerk there, until Huel's own running order was the only thing on the ground still sitting down. Sorrel waited out the silence with the patience of her kind. Then she stood, shook her mane flat, and turned her back on the glass, and walked deliberately, neither hurrying nor hesitating, north across the white grass, past the open gate, to the stone line, to the old lichened boundary stone itself, and the gallery's held breath broke into a low surf of whispering, because even the magistrates could feel that the animal had just declined the script. At the stone she stopped. Beasts ground past the stone. The gold country rolled away from her feet to the bluffs, every horizon of it humming with the held positions of her line, and she stood with her toes at the law's exact edge and her mane rising, and she opened her chest and she called. Not the soft interrogative, the relay call, full voice, the rolling carrying drum that passes the hunt, flung north across the unfenced like a rope thrown over water, and the unfenced answered her. The second ridge stood up. 12 shapes rose out of the long grass in a single motion, strung in relay order across half a kilometer of gold, plainly visible, mane up, and the answering drum came back south in a wave the gallery did not so much hear as feel through the soles of 1,100 pairs of feet, and the whispering surf became a sound Seja had never heard a bureau gallery make, half gasp and half cry, and on the press scaffold every lens on Maddow swung north at once. Old Brindle's command pulse rolled across the stones. Come, it said. The door is open. Come now, runner, come home. And Sorrel, 4 years old, flood-orphaned, hand-raised, den-proven, stood at the boundary of her two worlds with her whole line calling her from one side and one old man silent behind glass on the other, and turned her head south toward the observation block and did not cross. She drummed once more at the glass, across the whole width of the ceremony ground. The interrogative, again but louder, and this time with the second syllable, the one Seja had taught Dane by the fire in the north. The unit of relay grammar that turns a question into the question. The call a runner sends down the line when it stands ready at its position and cannot move because the order has not come. Position held, the animal called to the silent glass, in front of the bureau and the magistrates and every appealing handler on the planet. Position held. Release me. There, Seja breathed, to her recorder, to the old code, to her grandmother. There it is. She is not refusing the wild, Provost. She has never once refused the wild. She is waiting for the feed order. She will not eat out of turn, and she will not leave out of turn, because nothing you ever starved or stripped or silenced could make her forget that she is on a line, and the line releases its runners. She isn't failing your gate. She is keeping a law older than your doctrine, more faithfully than you have ever kept anything, and she will keep it until she dies in the keeping, in a room with no grass in it, unless someone on the people's side of that stone keeps it back. The ceremony clock stood at 41 minutes. On the platform, Provost Hewley straightened, and Seja saw him assemble the ending he had built the whole machine to produce, saw the document tube come up under his arm, and she stepped off the warden's mark and crossed the white grass and stood below the platform rail and said in the voice her people kept for speaking under hunters, carrying to him alone, Provost, look at her. You have 20 years of failures at gates like this one. You know what handler fixation looks like. The pacing, the crying at the glass, the unraveling. Look at that animal standing at the stone like a sentry and tell me, between professionals, on the worst record of your career or the best one, is that what breaking looks like? For one moment, one real moment that Seja would grant him for the rest of her life, Casimir Hule looked. The animal stood at the boundary stone, still as the stone, mane half raised, holding her position above 1,100 people the way she had held a den bank above 3 litters in the rain. Whatever the old Offrit saw in those 4 heartbeats, it reached something, because the scarred crest flattened and the thin gray face went briefly, honestly uncertain, 20 years of grief looking at 4 seconds of evidence. Then the clock turned over and the moment closed like a gate. What I see, Huel said, is an animal that will not go through an open door to its own kind, while a human it has imprinted on remains in line of sight, which is, warden, the text definition of the defect my standard exists to catch. He raised the document tube. The choreography stands. The clock stands. At the hour, the gate is spent. Then the choreography can spend it, said a third voice, but the law will want a word first. Director Faroon Oza had risen from the front row, leaning on her cane, and the ground went quiet around her, the way ground does when the oldest animal present stands up. She did not mount the platform. She stood on the people's grass with her field coat buttoned wrong and her clouded eye drifting, and she said conversationally, into 1,100 silences, Provost, your protocol annex designates this ceremony a thresholding under Part 1 of the release code. Your own document. I signed it. Which makes the operative law the threefold gate and the operative text the old one, and I have been sitting on this folding chair for 3/4 of an hour, listening to the warden of this range not say something, out of courtesy to your running order, that the code obliges her to say out loud before any third gate may be ruled spent. The good eye came around to Seja and held her, ancient and dry, and Seja saw with a jolt, amused, Warden Vale. You stood post at my left hand for the Kesrin Flats releases 15 years ago. You were the only junior on that range who ever read the old text past the ceremonial preface, so recite, Warden. Part 1. The Thresholding. The provision our colleague Standard has been standing on top of for 20 years. Let the record have the law in full, Seja turned. The clock behind her stood at 50 minutes. The animal at the stone had not moved. The whole Gold North was on its feet in the grass, waiting, and Seja Vale folded her ears flat to her skull, to the director, to the gallery, to the stone, and recited, in the old grammar first and then in the common tongue, the lines her grandmother had made her learn by lamplight before she was tall enough to see over a gate. At the third gate, the bond chooses its shape. The beast shall stand at the stone, and the line that raised it shall come to the stone, on the people's side, and keep the law of the stone, and there release it by the line's own word in the hearing of the country. For the wild does not receive what is abandoned. The wild receives what is given. She let the last line go out over the grass to wherever the recorders would carry it, and no gate is spent, and no thresholding ruled until the stone has heard the word of release. The Code of the Herd Wardens, Part 1, the Thresholding, lines 9 through 14. It has never been amended, Director. It has only stopped being read. The silence that followed had a new texture. It was the sound of 1,100 people turning to look at a glass-fronted observation block, and of a block of gray-coated appealing handlers rising to their feet in a single motion, and of Provost Casimir Hoole on his own platform, at his own ceremony, in front of his own assembled proof, discovering that the oldest law on the ground was on the other side. The handler of record, Hoole said, and for the first time in the season his voice came out a half-tone wrong, is barred from the ceremony ground under severance protocol, which is an administrative standard, Director Oza said pleasantly, subordinate to code. I have given my circuit ruling. The stone will hear the word of release, or this gate cannot lawfully be spent today or ever. Sergeant Marsk opened the block, let the man out. And so it was that at 54 minutes by the ceremony clock, on the white grass of Threshold Station 6, in the hearing of 3 districts, the circuit press, the Office of Wild Integrity, and 12 wild sythar standing the long grass north of the law, the glass door of the observation block was unsealed, and Dane Mercer, horticulturist 3rd grade, 63 years old, put his hat on his head and walked out across the provost's chalked choreography to the boundary stone, where his girl stood waiting, position held, for the only voice on any world with the authority to relieve her. She did not break toward him. That was the detail the circuit press would replay for a year, the detail that buried the severance standard deeper than any ruling. 400 kilos of apex predator, separated from her person by 30 days of protocol and 40 days of cold camps and 1 engineered hour of silence. And when he finally came out onto the grass, she held her position at the stone like a soldier on parade, trembling, mane storming, drumming her soft one beat over and over, mine now, and let him come to her, because the law of the stone was the law, and somebody she loved had taught her at a feed pan years ago that the law holds until the whistle says otherwise. He stopped an arm's length away, on the people's side, with the toes of his boots at the lichened edge of the oldest line on Maddow, and took his hat off, and for a while the two of them looked at each other while 1,100 people learned what silence was actually for. Well, Dane said at last, in the mild, level banked fire voice that 40 recorder drones carried to the rim of the circuit, look at you, standing your post. He cleared his throat, only once, and his hands were steady on the hat brim. I'm going to tell you some things now, girl, and you'll forgive me if I take a minute over it, because I had a speech and it's gone. I found you in moving water, and I never once owned you. I know the bureau papers say different. Papers say all kinds of things. What I had was the raising of you, and the raising of a thing is just a long, slow giving of it away. Every day a little, that's the whole trade, and anyone who tells you different has never grown anything they loved. His voice stayed level. His eyes did not. You don't owe me staying. You never did. The debt runs the other road entire, 4 years of watching something wild be patient with an old man's pace, and there's only one way I know to pay it. He looked north, past her, at the 12 standing shapes in the gold, at the old scarred queen at their head, and he put his hat back on, and he gave the country his word. They're yours and you're theirs, Dane Mercer said, in the hearing of the stone, the way the code required. I release you, with all my heart glad and grieving both, which is the only honest way anything was ever let go of. Mind the old queen. Feed in your turn. And if a flood ever takes the ground out from under you again, anywhere, any year, the level voice bent at last 1 degree, no more. You drum and you keep drumming, and old as I am, I will hear it. And he raised 2 fingers to his mouth and whistled. 2 notes, low, then high. The pan is down, the waiting is over. Go on. She crossed the stone line like water leaving a broken dam. 3 bounds took her past the boundary into the gold, and the gallery came up off its chairs in a single roar that no bureau running order had scripted, and the wild line broke from its positions and flowed downhill to meet her, and they collided in the open grass 200 paces into the unfenced in a wheeling, drumming storm of slate and tawny, 12 runners and a 13th, the whole rolling celebration of it carrying north and north like weather going home. At the warden's mark, HFY stood with her ears flat and the tears running openly down her gray-mauve face into the collar of her uniform on every lens on the planet, making no attempt at all to stop them, entering into her recorder in a voice that did not entirely hold the only ruling that was hers to make. The third gate is satisfied. Subject R12 called Sorrel is released in good standing. Gate closing on my order in a moment. Gate closing in a moment. It should have ended there. For everyone whose name was not Casimir Hool it had. Afterward, the inquiry would establish the sequence precisely, because 40 drones had it from every angle. The subject in the wild line mid-celebration 200 paces out. The gates still live, the warden's closing order not yet given. And the provost of the Office of Wild Integrity descending from the platform with the document tube in his fist, and the dart team sergeant being beckoned up from the equipment line because the writ in the tube was a confiscation writ held in abeyance pending outcome, and the outcome had gone against him in front of every appealing handler on Maddow, and a man who has stood 20 years on top of a doctrine does not always notice, in the moment the doctrine goes out from under him, where his feet have decided to take him instead. The discharge is not signed, he was saying, in a voice that had left its public register entirely, to Marsk, to the dart sergeant, to anyone in gray. Until the discharge is signed, that animal is bureau property in an active recovery posture, and I am ordering a recovery. Range band it before it reaches the bluffs. We will adjudicate the warden's theatrics in chambers. This remains provost, Seja said, once, sharp with everything she had. The gate is live, the stone. He did not hear her, or he heard her the way he had heard her all season. Provost Casimir Hool, author of the Severance Standard, who 1 hour earlier had read the first law of the threshold aloud to 1,100 people, in his own flat translation, walked past the warden's mark, past the chalk, between 2 lichened boundary stones, and out onto the beast's ground of an open gate, alone, with a writ in his hand, and the dart sergeant stopped dead at the line behind him, because the dart sergeant, whatever his orders, had been raised on a range. The gold grass north of the stone, which to a gallery's eyes held one celebrating pack 200 paces away, stood up. They had never all gone downhill. Seja understood it in the same heartbeat the provost did, understood that the line had come south 12 strong, but had deployed the way lines deploy, celebration forward, sentries back, and the sentries had been lying in the long grass within 40 paces of the stones the entire hour, holding position above the people the way their kind held positions above anything they had decided to keep. The dun female with the kinked tail rising out of the gold to the provost's left, the white-footed male to his right, a third and fourth shape behind, mane up, silent, and Casimir Hool stopped walking. One tall gray figure alone on the wrong side of the law he had just finished reciting, with 4 wild apex predators standing around him in a closing arc and his writ hanging from his hand like a leaf. Nobody on the people's side moved. Nobody could. The first law binds in both directions, and every warden on the ground knew that the worst thing 1,100 panicking people could do for the man was make a sound. And so the whole assembled machinery of the Office of Wild Integrity stood frozen behind a chalk line and watched its provost's knees begin very slightly, very publicly to shake. It was Sorrel who came back for him. She came out of the celebration at an easy lope, unhurried, the new 13th runner of the Rhone line, and the sentries held their arc and let her through, and she walked once around the rigid gray figure of the man who had ordered her crated, scent-stripped, silenced, severed, and remanded to a room with no grass in it, reading him head to foot, the trembling crest, the dangling writ, the smell of doctrine giving way to the smell of fear. The gallery did not breathe. The drones drank it. And then the deadliest animal on the Rhone sweep did to Provost Casimir Hool the single most operatically humiliating thing in her entire vocabulary, the thing the den banks of the Gulch country reserved for creatures too small and too foolish to be on dangerous ground. She herded him, shoulder to his hip, gently, irresistibly, the way a yearling minder bumps a straying cub. She turned him around and walked him back across the beast's ground, one bump at a time, pausing when he stumbled, waiting with visible patience while he found his feet, escorting the author of the severance standard step by step to the boundary, and delivered him over the stone line onto the people's grass directly in front of the press scaffold, and stood over the stone a moment, looking down at him, mane flat, entirely calm. Then she drummed at him, once softly, the small, falling beat that Sejah's grandmother's books glossed in the old grammar as the correction given to cubs, and which the circuit press by nightfall, working from the warden's own published drum lexicon, would translate for 11 worlds as stay in the den, little one, and turned her back on him forever, and went home to her line at a dead easy run that never once looked back. The sound the gallery made then was not the roar from the crossing. It started somewhere among the appealing handlers, low, helpless, disbelieving, and rolled outward row by row through magistrates and clerks and press, and the dart team itself until the whole white ground of Threshold Station 6 was one standing storm of it, 1,100 witnesses laughing, not cruelly even, but completely, the way people laugh when a thing 20 years too heavy finally falls over, and in the middle of the storm, on the people's grass where the Wild had filed him, sat the provost of the Office of Wild Integrity, alive, unscratched, escorted, with his writ still in his hand and his doctrine nowhere at all. Director Oza did not laugh. Sejah, crossing the ground to help the old Afrit to his feet because no one else was moving to do it, heard the director's cane ring once on the chalk for order, and the circuit's ruling came down on the spot, into the open record, in the dry, unhurried voice of an 81-year-old who had buried better doctrines than this one. Let the record carry 4 findings, Director Oza said. 1. The release of Subject R12 stands witnessed by this office and, I think we may fairly enter, by the Wild itself. 2. Confiscation writ 7 threshold is rescinded, and I am referring the severance standards mandatory clauses to full circuit review with my recommendation that they be struck, the data behind them being, as today demonstrated, the record of our own cruelty conducting its own grading. 3. The old code's thresholding text is restored to operational force on every range on this circuit, effective before I sit down. Wardens will conduct releases as the herd wardens wrote them. The bond walked to the stone and given its word, not cut. The clerks will want a modern name for the disposition. The clouded eye drifted toward Sejah, and the good one glinted. Enter it as Warden Vale's field log has it. Released in good standing. Bond carried, not cut, and 4. She looked down at Huel, and her voice gentled by exactly 1 degree, the degree owed to 20 years and an old scar. The provost crossed a live stone line today in front of 3 districts, an error of range discipline we require junior wardens to write out by hand until they stop making it. He is relieved of field authority on medical grounds, the medical grounds being that the field has plainly ceased to agree with him, and reassigned to the circuit boundary survey, where he will personally inspect, catalog, and certify the condition of every boundary stone on Maddow. A pause dry as the sweep. There are 9,000 of them. He may begin with this one. It has recently seen use. They gave Sejah the gate to close. At sundown, with the gallery gone and the chalk already blurring and the chairs folded onto their trucks, she pulled the pins herself, the last act of a live release, and stood a while at the boundary with Dane Mercer in the long red light, listening to the dusk relay start up away north, the 13 voices, and if one voice came in a half-beat eager on the changes, well, the line would school it. Lines did. She'll range the Gulch country 2 seasons, maybe 3, Sejah said. Then Brindle will go, the way queens go, out walking one morning and not back. And the line will sort itself, and I'd not bet a single form against your girl standing matriarch on the roan. Sweep before she's 8. First flood orphan in the registry to hold a line. She looked at the old man sidelong. The code allows a handler of record 1 visit custom, you know. The old text calls it the stone meeting. First thaw, every year, the people's side of the stone. You stand there, and you don't cross, and what comes to the other side comes. First thaw, Dane said, and turned his hat once and put it on. I can keep that calendar. He kept it for the rest of his life. The circuit knows the rest, because the circuit watched it become the most quietly famous appointment on Maddow. Every first thaw morning, an old horticulturist walking out from Threshold Station 6 to the lichened stone with a feed pan he never filled and never needed, out of pure ceremony, and standing there in the cold gold light while the unfenced delivered its matriarch. She came every year. She came the year she led the line south around the burned country, and the year of the deep snows, and the year she came slow and gray-muzzled herself with her own grown daughters flanking her, and every year it went the same way. The great slate-on queen of the roan sweep stopping with her toes exactly at the law's edge, a hand's breadth from the old man's boots, and the 2 of them standing head-to-head in the wind, breathing each other in, drumming and murmuring their 2 old languages across the line neither of them ever again crossed, because the not crossing was the whole vow. And both of them had been built, in their different countries, to keep a law to the end. And on the morning the warden's registry will mark forever, the 11th thaw, when Sorrel came down to the stone trailed by a half-grown slate and tawny cub with a storm mane still in its fuzz, and nosed it forward, and set it down once deliberately directly on Dane Mercer's boots, before gathering it back. Sajah Vale was standing post a respectful 40 paces off, recorder running, ears flat, watching an 80-year-old man laugh and weep into the wind off the unfenced with a wild queen's cub smell on his boots and not one single thing in the world severed, and she entered the line that the cadet wardens of 3 circuits now learn before they ever touch a gate. Final entry, Stone Meeting 11. The Bureau spent 20 years asking how to make the wild forget. The answer was at the stone the whole time: you don't. You raise them with your whole heart. You walk them to the line, you give the word, and you let them carry you out into the gold. Love that cannot let go is never love. Love that lets go is never lost. The bond chooses its shape. Hers chose the wide one. End of entry. Gate closed.